This is the Spiritual Download. This is my second interview with Harri Aalto. Hi, Harri.
Nice to see you again.
So we're going to start talking right away with the idea of self-awareness and being conscious. Harri, what would you say are some of the keys for being aware that we are naturally conscious beings?
Every human being has self-awareness, and the question really is, are you aware that you're having self-awareness? If you're aware of it, if you're aware of self-awareness all the time, 24 hours a day, then it's called self-realization. If you're aware, most people have some kind of awareness. You can't be alive if you don't. And to various degrees of understanding and clarity, they know they're having some kind of self-awareness. And if it's 100%, then it's realization. If it's 50%, then it isn't. Self-awareness is very simple. Everybody has self-awareness, and the goal in our existence is to develop a state of consciousness that is always awake to itself. And this wakefulness is not something that we contrive or make up. It's not a mood. It's inherent to human consciousness. Human consciousness has the ability to be awake to itself. Internal to the experience of this stillness that exists in every human awareness is the ability to be aware of that stillness. Being aware of that stillness all the time is called self-realization, and that's why we're here on Earth to experience.
Now, most people use the word consciousness in our society as like, yeah, I'm conscious, I can move my hands, I can move my eyes, I'm not passed out. Now, do you think that is a different definition of the kind of consciousness that like people who are into the ideas of non-duality, spirituality, is that unique?
Yes. Let's look at what most people experience. When most people look at an object in their environment, all they see is the object, nothing else. They don't have any awareness that there's an experiencer to seeing that object. Now, a self-aware person is not overshadowed or hidden by looking at anything. Their environment is an added experience to the stillness that they're experiencing inside. In other words, self-awareness is there. Whatever they're hearing, talking, walking, self-awareness is not the only, is the walking, the talking, and the experience is not the only experience. There's an inner experience of stillness that's also there all the time, and that is called self-awareness. And if it's there all the time, it's called realization. The average person looks at something, there's a complete loss of the self. You just see the object, that's all.
Okay. Well, do you think you could briefly introduce your book, and then you can maybe read the phrase that we had originally prepared for you to read?
So I wrote this book here, and it looks like a porcupine because I got all these notes here, but we're going to ignore those. This is called The Landscape of Enlightenment. It goes on the bestseller list even after 2 years off and on Amazon. And I realize you don't have to sell a lot of books to go on the bestseller list on Amazon, but still, after 2 years, it's still selling quite well. So I'm going to read a section on this book, since we've been talking about self-awareness. Describing self-awareness is simple. A realized individual describing their experience is just like anyone describing a familiar scene that they are observing. This process only requires looking upon the now familiar silence and the details and movements of the fluctuations of our own being, and then describing what we see. Depending on the clarity of the experience, of the inner experience, and the understanding of the experience, the see-through nature of inner to outer unbounded perception can be simply described like any other observation. It does not take a genius particular skills or an advanced degree to be self-aware or to be able to describe that state to anyone else. Arriving at the goal, one simply knows and sees the goal as the normal experience of one's own daily consciousness. Opening of the mouth is almost all that is required. To the habituated experience of the absolute does not feel unique. By absolute, I mean self-awareness. On the contrary, it feels normal. The first glorious expressions of that absolute sound and movement, the expressions of the divine heavens, also feel normal. And finally, our material world, when it is experienced as the fullest expression of the nature of our own consciousness, it too is completely normal. Ultimately, since there is really nothing outside the state, there is nothing left to be abnormal. It's kind of interesting, that, you could easily say that self-awareness is the normal state of human consciousness, and the state of a partial awareness is not normal. Well, that's not a bad thing to be, you could sort of say suffering is not normal. Being in a state of wakefulness where the suffering and all these things diminish greatly is a much more normal state to be in. And the people that I've been aware of who in our discussions have, and a number of people have woken up during the years that I've been doing these discussions, the first thing they say is, but I've always had this experience. How come I didn't know it? It's that natural. It's that simple. It's not a mood that takes over. It's not something you make up or can make up. Something dramatically changes in your consciousness. Self-realization is a big change, but yet the experience is basically something you've always had. And some people say things like, give me my money back, or something of that nature, but I'm not meaning to put it down in any way, because these states of consciousness as they arrive, they can be quite spectacular, very invigorating, and what's missing in most people's lives, we lead lives where there's nothing but change. Everything we do doesn't last. We earn this amount of money, we go to work every day, it's always a different day. We need more money the next day. Even if we make a lot of money, we just want more money. If we climb one mountaintop, then we have another one to climb and another one. So you could say that change is the nature of our lives. And how do we get into a state where we can have the experience of all that change and enjoy it, and still have this inner silence, or this inner stillness? And I have to add that this realization state, this inner stillness, isn't something that will eliminate change or make it less and less. On the contrary, the stillness of pure consciousness of the realized state incorporates all this change and gives it a foundation that doesn't change. So you suddenly know, in the realized state, you are an eternal being, you're infinite. There's a stable element that doesn't change. It doesn't matter how high you climb the mountain. When that mountain climb is over, you still have the stillness and the next experience and the next experience. And suddenly you have a stability to your life that means something, that has, gives a contentment or integration to your life that's always there. So as a consequence, this fuller being is able to enjoy the mountain climb more, not less.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, how does this relate to death? Because if, life is only one of the states, if there's, life and death, and awakening happens for sure in a lifetime, how does awakening relate to death?
Well, that's certainly getting to the question. Everybody ages. It doesn't matter how awake you are. There's an aging process takes place. The body goes through changes, and then eventually the body passes on. But the gross physical body is one kind of consciousness. Is one kind of physiology. There's a subtle physiology. You can call it a celestial physiology, or you want to just call it a subtle physiology. That's fine. That subtle physiology survives the death of the body, and consciousness itself doesn't pass on. Consciousness itself, which is outlasts the body, is eternal. And once the mind is realized, then there's a knowingness that consciousness is eternal, and it can take on bodies like coats. You put on this coat because it's cold, and you put on this coat because you want to, or you put on this coat, and life after life, or you have life on the so-called celestial level, or whatever. And then, as long as the self is realized, then the knowingness tells you that you are an eternal being, that death doesn't have any sway over your consciousness. It still has sway over your body, not over your consciousness.
So how does that relate to mindfulness? Do you see that there might be a distinction between the awake state and being mindful? Because I feel that, for example, if when I studied Zen a little bit, it was kind of like I felt like I was efforting to remain mindful. I was trying to use mental energy to reduce the amount of thoughts that were coming in my mind. I'm thinking that mindfulness practice is different than actually being awake. I don't know if have you noticed that before?
Mindfulness, to the degree that I understand it, and I've not done it, is a process. It's a technique. You do it consciously, right? The realized state is a state of spontaneous wakefulness. It's spontaneous, and it automatically affects everything. You don't have to go looking for realization. Once you have it, it's just always there. From how I understand mindfulness, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's something you do consciously. You put your mind on something. I'm not saying you concentrate or anything, but I am saying you're looking for something to put your mind on, and then you do that, and then after your experience is over, your mindfulness is gone, and you have to do it again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it seems like it's kind of a sort of practice. Could you talk about the importance, or maybe even the non-importance of practice in the realms of, I'm thinking in particular of if practice leads to that sense of seeking, I'm wondering if you find that drive for enlightenment, is that a deterrence to enlightenment, or does that actually help you on the path?
To get realized, you come from a state that isn't realized. You have to start somewhere, right? Just put some numbers on it. You're 30% realized, and then you practice meditation, or you prayer, or whatever you do. Then at some time later, maybe you're 40%. So there's a process, there's a path. Now, life in general is evolutionary, so it's progressing anyway. But it's on a very grand and slow scale. You can accelerate that process by going into various techniques. For instance, meditation. If it's a good meditation technique, it quiets the mind and takes you to the ground state of human experience, and then you come out, you lose it, you meditate again, then you lose it again. Every time you do that, you go in meditation, come out, go in, you maintain more and more of the self-awareness, and eventually, if your meditation technique is successful and it's a good meditation process, then eventually you gain a state of realization. And it is a process you have to go through. It's something you have to do. You can accelerate your growth, or you can just let it go the way it goes, which is an extremely slow process. And the mindfulness process, I don't know enough about it to know, is it something that's supposed to lead to self-realization, or is it just something that's supposed to make you feel good? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me.
Yeah, I think in Zen, from what I know, is the idea is that you're training your mind to have less and less thoughts, and that you're becoming one-pointed in your awareness, and that has to do a lot with, I think, concentration. So I do think one path towards that way, that to enlightenment, is practicing concentration, so that eventually you can you're so good at concentrating your mind in one pointedness that then your mind basically stops and you naturally become who you are. So it's that's kind of a slower, from what I understand, more of a slower process to enlightenment. And then in not a Neo Advaita, but Advaita Vedanta, when you practice self-inquiry, it's concentration not on the outside world, but it's concentration on who you actually are, or actually what you are. It's the inquiry into what am I truly, and that concentration also reduces your thoughts of your ego, like what am I going to have for lunch? Wow, I'm really tired. I need a coffee. Things like this naturally slow down. They might occur, but you do not attach to the thoughts, even though they might appear. Um, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, it sounds like the theory is the same as meditation, right? Only you do a conscious process now. With meditation, meditation that is effective, is spontaneous, and it doesn't involve concentration. At least my experience of, I've done TM, right? And there's no effort involved in the process. There is a process that takes one down to a quieter and quieter and quieter level. There's a technique for that. It's very simple. And then it seems to me that many of the other techniques, mindfulness included, is that you're looking for a state of no thoughts, no attachment, and whereas in actual fact, that's never been my experience. Years ago, when I had my first state of openness or realization, there was this quiet stillness there, but it wasn't empty. It felt like, even though it was abstract and unbounded, it felt totally full. It felt like I knew everything. I didn't really know very much, but it felt like I knew everything. And and uh, and there was this sense of fullness there that started growing. And if there ever was a state of separation or emptiness, it didn't stay that way very long. It continued to fill up with. In a sense, what happened is that even with eyes open, walking down the street, I began to understand that the widest level of the mind was somehow connected to the outside, how my senses function, how my eyes function, my ears function. And they became kind of one vibratory knowingness of the self. It was one see through consciousness, inside, outside, no separation. There was this unified sense to it. So maybe in that way it's different from mindfulness. I was never looking for emptiness or even unattachment. Those things just happened. There was this lack of attachment, but the lack of attachment didn't eliminate anything. It actually joined everything together and gave me a sense of oneness or totality. And it also gave that sense that we're talking about, this whole death thing you were talking about, this feeling of an infinite life. Consciousness has some sort of, it's the life of the universe. And you kind of sense that you're part of that, and you have that same longevity that the universe has. And that's a pretty long period of time.
So yeah, can you talk about the importance of realizing that the universe is your same essence, but also how do you connect that to the human body and the human mind? Like, is the human body and the human mind an obstacle or a tool towards enlightenment and realization of I am the universe?
It's a beautiful question, because certainly in the beginning days, when I was in my early 20s, I went through many stages of realization. I had no idea what the universe was, and I had no idea what I was experiencing, even didn't understand it. But over time, the self-awareness, it's kind of like I started seeing the mechanics of how the inside and the outside consciousness person, in terms of the immediate environment, how they were connected, and and how self-awareness itself vibrates it in a certain way where the outside experience, my daily life, walking down the street or whatever, or looking at stuff or understanding stuff, um, how the inside and the outside were very much unified, very much the same experience, seeing with the eyes closed and seeing with the eyes open. Now, that's just in terms of the immediate environment. After meditating a number of years, this immediate, and I can't explain how, but somehow I began to sense that not only was my immediate environment in terms of myself, related to the self, connected to the self, or one inner illuminated state, but the distant environment, the universe itself, or let's say the cosmos itself, the planets, the stars, somehow they also appeared to be part of my consciousness. So I got this sense that the body, and at first it was just a sense, it was a microcosm of the macrocosm, something. The universe is big, I am small, yet I was like a mirror. If you take the smallest mirror and hold it, outward, and you can get a whole mountain in there in a tiny little mirror. So it felt like my consciousness was like a mirror to the universe. The same geometry that was in my body was the geometry of the universe, and they were somehow connected. At first, I didn't see how that happened, but over time, I began to see you could say I began to see how the connectedness actually worked, how the elements of nature, fire, air, water, and all the elements of nature, how they created the body. And I could physically start seeing how they functioned, how they created the body, how they created the senses. And I began to see that there was a deep, deep internal connectedness between the natural environment and my physiology. The different areas of the body were connected to different areas of the natural environment, and then eventually of the cosmic environment. And ultimately, realization reveals that everything is contained in the awake experience. There isn't anything that's excluded, including the universe. As funny as it sounds, or as broad as that sounds, that's my experience. And I'm not saying that I experience every little iota of what the universe is. I don't, but I do have this sense, and it's always there, that I'm not just a small physical being walking here on earth. I'm connected to the society. I'm connected to the world. The world is connected to the solar system, and the solar system is connected to the universe. And all of that feels like my own consciousness. It's not so much like I'm in that phenomenon. That phenomenon is in me. Or you could say it's both directions. Like that.
Yeah, so what do you think is the role of the human species in, I guess, the unfolding of the universe? Now, like, I guess my question necessitates that the universe has its own purpose. So I guess, so do you think that the universe has a purpose? And B, what is the human being's role in serving or bringing about that purpose?
You certainly do ask the big questions, don't you? One thing I noticed, in the early days of my meditation, my experience was kind of random. There was, I experienced this silence, but I didn't know what it was. Over time, this silence seemed to have a very specific role, to an intelligence to the vibration of this knowingness that was the self. There was an intelligence to it. And over time, I began to see this intelligence as something very specific. And it was this intelligence of the self, of the silence. There was this very specific pattern and very specific, I don't know what else to call it other than intelligence, that connected it to universal existence. If and universal existence had that same intelligence on this cosmic scale and on a universal scale that I had on a that I have on an individual scale, on a physiology scale, on the scale of this body, and the scale of this life, and they're connected. They support each other. Somehow, universality or the universal consciousness created the earth and then created societies and created human beings as kind of what archetypal beings that for the enjoyment of the universal self, we became individual selves. And it's such an intimate, eternal connection between the two. I think they're both dependent on each other. It certainly sometimes feels to me that I create the universe just as much as the universe creates me. Whether that's actually the case or not remains to be seen, but that's what it feels like. And that's where this eternal sense of the self being eternal and infinite comes from. I mean, an infinite being, an eternal being, is absolutely connected to the universe and those qualities in the universe. The universe is eternal. Modern physics is coming up with all kinds of, understandings, multiple universes, this, that, and the other thing, and that they have no understanding that there's an end to this whole show. They think the universe is expanding, but on the level of consciousness, there doesn't seem to be an end to it. If I look at the universe as a whole, surely the Big Bang came from somewhere. If all the information for this universe was already there somewhere, and that somewhere was in consciousness, universal consciousness. And if I'm universal consciousness, then somehow I'm also connected to that Bang and the information that was in there. And that's the sense I have, is that I'm connected to that whole process. And I think everybody who wakes up has that sense that somehow they're connected to universal events, and the universal events are connected to individual events. They're the same thing. And as a matter of fact, I'd say one of the biggest benefits of realization is you begin to sense this universality, the fullness of your own consciousness, not the emptiness. The emptiness is there too, and that silence is there. But along with that silence, there's that universality that I am everything feeling, like in the Upanishads, that, whatever stream of Mahavakyas, I am that, the whole I've had, all this is nothing. You see, you begin to live those qualities and understand them.
So with the individual now, if the universe and human beings do have purpose, now does each individual have their own unique purpose, and how do you have to wake up to realize that purpose, or do you think average people have an intuitive sense of their role in life?
We're not individuals in the sense that we live in a society, we live in a town, we live in a group of people, we have our families, we have our friends. The whole society on Earth shares a common evolutionary process, and is that purposeful? Certainly it seems purposeful to me. It sounds like something specific is happening, whether it's positive things or negative things. There's some kind of value to the progress that's taking place on Earth. Every hurdle we have to jump over makes us stronger. Every divine experience we have makes us stronger. I tend to look at the evolutionary process of, the society as a whole, just as important as the evolution of the individual. I don't think they're separate. I think they're the same thing. Sort of, from a universal point of view, every human being on Earth is part of the parcel and part of the, when I talk about unified consciousness, or when I talk about the realized self, I talk about a unified sense, and that unified sense has to be unified with something. And what is it unified with? It's unified with the society and the whole, all of us beings here on Earth. And A realized person starts having great compassion for the world and for the suffering of the world and for the enlightenment of the world, and and, and can't help sharing their own experience with people, and hopefully that helps a number of people also wake up to get the picture, the bigger picture, not just daily life, but everybody's life.
So it seems like daily life is one aspect of the entire landscape of consciousness. And I'm wondering if, could you kind of explain what are these different, I don't know the right word, layers or realms of the totality? So including the individual self and then the overall large totality of, infinite consciousness. But if it's a landscape, what are these levels in between?
Well, my experience is that I have pure consciousness. There's this stillness that vibrates. It's very intelligent. And by that intelligent, I mean it's connected to a field of expression, of its own expression, which has a divine quality to it. This divine quality looks like, feels like, and are the, let's call them the laws of nature, the principles of nature. And these fluctuations of my individual self seem to be fluctuations of the divine or universal quality to consciousness. This universal quality, this divine quality of consciousness connects physical life, immediate physical life to the field of my silent self or still self. And these laws of nature that are also the elements of nature, fire, water, air, looking at them in the fundamental sense, they percolate through cosmic events and create societies and planets and human beings, individual human beings. And these elements of nature are really nothing but fluctuations of my own consciousness. And these fluctuations are kind of like a continuum from pure consciousness to divine consciousness to the surface value of consciousness. First in the immediate environment and then in the distant environment. I experience that it's one cosmic continuum of fullness that is my own consciousness. And there's an intimate relationship between the universe and between inner awareness. And I don't view that I even have inner awareness. It's all both inner and outer. It's one totality of consciousness that just expresses itself as completely silent, that has a divine expression, that has a material, physical expression, has a cosmic expression, and has a universal expression. They all vibrate together as one intelligence, as one formless. And who's creating who can't actually tell. Let's say we're both creating each other. If you want to look at there's a creator to the whole process, you could say, I certainly believe there is a creator to the whole process. I do believe that there's a very, very basic intelligence and specificity to evolution itself, the human consciousness, to the societal consciousness, the world consciousness, the cosmic consciousness, and universal. They're all one and the same phenomenon. That's how I experience it.